So it is 7, so I will get started. I know that we all probably want to hear all about Rockefeller and still have time to take a breather before we go and listen to another debate. And so I will get us started. So welcome everybody tonight. My name is Karen Lawrence. I'm the Assistant Director of the Case Western Reserve University's Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program. It's a huge mouthful. And I'm really excited. So tonight is the first in what I hope will be a long and ongoing series that's co-sponsored by the Cleveland History Center and the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland on Cleveland history. We've named it the Cleveland Civic Series. We're still workshopping that title. So if anybody has clever names that they would like to suggest to us, please let us know in the chat and the Q&A button. If you have questions for John throughout the course of the lecture, again, all the audience, your audio and your cameras have been muted, but you can either use the chat or the Q&A buttons down there to type in your questions for John. And I say this all the time, but one of the nice features of this is that if you have a question 5 minutes into the presentation, you can type that question in, press enter, and it's there waiting for us at the end of the lecture. And so you can just sort of zing us the whole time through with all of your questions. Also, right before, I promise I will introduce John and let him start. I also want to let you guys know about a couple of other lectures that are coming up that if you're interested in this, you'll probably be interested in these other ones too. In fact, the second of this Cleveland Civic series is coming up in 2 weeks. So Wednesday, October 21st at 7 p.m. Also, I think is going to be just incredibly fascinating. It's about the Michael White years by the journalists who covered him. And so it's going to be a panel moderated by Mark with Brent Larkin, Ted Barris, and Leon talking all about, it's going to be really fascinating, talking about the Mike White mayoral years. And then as a 1-2 punch, the next night, actually, October 22nd on Thursday at 6 p.m., there's a lecture that's being co-sponsored by the Think Forum, Case Western Reserve University History Associates, and the Department of History. It's the you can probably, I'm afraid I'm going to butcher this, the Carl W. Ubelodi, thank you so much. Ubelodi lecture. Martha Jones, who is a Society of Black Alumni presidential professor and a professor of history at Johns Hopkins, is going to be talking about Vanguard, African-American women and the road from suffrage to voting rights. So again, this is the 100th year of the 19th Amendment. That's going to be fascinating. So we'll put the links to register for both of those free lectures in the chat button as well. But tonight we are here to hear about Deconstructing the Rockefeller Myth from John Grabowski, who I know a lot of you know well. He's a favorite of the League of Women Voters and Siegel Lifelong Learning. He has a joint appointment in the history department at Case Western Reserve University and is also a historian and senior vice president for research and publications at the Western Reserve Historical Society. And he specializes in all sorts of Cleveland history, immigration and ethnicity, especially local Cleveland urban history, public history, and is the overseer of the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, and has written all sorts of books and articles about Cleveland history. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, John, to hear all about Rockefeller in Cleveland.
Another John in Cleveland. Thanks so much, Karen. Delighted to be here this evening, and I can't see you. You'll have questions. I'll bring in the questions later. To add a little bit to my resume, I'm not actually a Rockefeller expert. I've known about him for years because he comes from Cleveland. And this presentation is sort of a preview for something I'm going to be writing for Michael Barron for Digital Cleveland. And that will be an essay on Rockefeller in Cleveland. So this is a test run in a way, but it should be a solid test run. And let me say before I get started that there are several books that I would suggest that you pick up after this to follow up. The one that relates to John D. Rockefeller in Cleveland is Grace Goulder-Izant's 1972 book, John D. Rockefeller, The Cleveland Years. I've relied a good deal on that. The other book is a monstrous book in the 1990s. You probably have heard of it. It's Ron Chernow's book, Titan, an extraordinarily insightful, well-written, exciting biography of John D. Rockefeller. And then if you want to go back a few decades with the historian Alan Nevins, who did 2 books on Rockefeller and Standard Oil. There are obviously, if you go there are hundreds, if not thousands of books that touch upon John D. Rockefeller. Let me start my remarks by sort of a strange introduction. And I will take you to a lecture hall in Turkey in the early 2000s. And I was part of a panel discussing aspects of Turkish history and United States history, particularly philanthropy in Turkey. And a good friend of mine, Ken Rose, Dr. Kenneth Rose, who actually wrote 500 articles for the first encyclopedia, was there. And Ken, by that time, was working at the Rockefeller Archives Center in Pocantico Hills. And he surprised me. He came up with an extraordinary paper about the university in Turkey that I worked at called Bilkent University, and indicated that the founder of that university, Ihsan Doramaja, had basically helped build his career virtue of a Rockefeller educational grant to build pediatrics in Turkey. So here I am in Turkey, and I'm listening about John D. Rockefeller and his legacy. Ken Rose, sadly, is no longer with us, but he, along with Darwin Stapleton, who taught history at CWRU and then went on to become the director of the Rockefeller Archives Center, really are the people that I rely on when looking for the Cleveland story on Rockefeller. So what is the Rockefeller myth? Well, how do I see it? This is the Cleveland perspective. Now, there are a lot of myths about Rockefeller, but I want to talk about a money myth, particularly today. Let me just outline where we're going to end up in this presentation. These points of consideration. One is that Rockefeller abandoned Cleveland because of ill treatment by the press and or because of an attempt to tax him after he had made New York City his legal residence. More about that later. Then the big one is that Western Reserve University refused Rockefeller money, and thus it went to the University of Chicago. The third one is a little more problematic. That is that Rockefeller's benevolence to Cleveland was not as considerable as it could have been. That's a loaded question. And then the fourth one is kind of a toss-up, but New York City got Rockefeller Center and not Cleveland because of point 1 above. Now, these are the points that I want to get to, but before we get to them, I want to give you an outline of his life in Cleveland and how he created Standard Oil and what his position became nationally and internationally. So let's get started. Rockefeller's parents are Eliza Davison and William Avery Rockefeller. The story of their meeting is quite interesting. Eliza was living with her family in New York State, and a peddler or promoter came up. It happened to be William Avery Rockefeller, and he supposedly was deaf mute, and he was sketching out what he wanted and explaining his situation on a chalkboard and showing it to 2 of the women in the house, including Eliza. And Eliza, who was a younger woman at that time, said something to the effect that if he were deaf and mute, I'd marry him. Now, this is a story that has gone down. I believe it is correct. And eventually, a couple of weeks later, William Avery Rockefeller turned up again and explained his ruse to them. And the 2 of them married, much to Eliza Davison's father's disgust. William Avery Rockefeller is an interesting character. You know something about him. We'll talk a bit more about him as we go along. He made a lot of money by horse trading, by selling elixirs and patent medicines. And he was also now proven to be a bigamist. So we'll get to that part of the story a bit later. Rockefeller was born in Richford, New York. I like the first syllable of Richford, July 8th, 1839. The family then moved to Moravia, New York, and then to Oswego, New York, and then to Strongsville and Parma. John was about 4 or 5 when they moved from Richford to Moravia. His memoirs indicate that he loved Moravia, New York. The picture that you're looking at is the Rockefeller House in Richford, which no longer exists. And there's a long story to that. And from Owego, New York, the family came 1852 or 1853 to Strongsville and Parma. John D. Rockefeller and later his brother William would eventually board with a Mrs. Wooden at Erie Street, that's 9th Street in St. Clair in Cleveland, circa 1853. The story is that while the family was in Moravia, there were rumors circulated about the father. And the rumors eventually were proven to be that he apparently in another part of New York on one of his travels, he was away from the house constantly. He would always come back with money. He was jolly, but apparently he tried to force his attentions on a young woman and was charged with rape. Then when the family comes to Cleveland, this is something that Chernow deals with. He feels that Rockefeller moved the family to Cleveland because he wanted to be closer to a woman in Ontario with whom he was having a relationship and whom he would eventually marry. So one of the hidden ghosts in Rockefeller's family is the father. He does turn up. He lends money to John D. Rockefeller, 10% interest. Rockefeller appreciates his father's smartness with money. He even turns up when Rockefeller is famous. There are pictures of him at the Rockefeller home in New York City or in upstate New York with some of the Rockefeller grandchildren. He's buried not in the Rockefeller family plot in Cleveland, but he's buried in a plot in Illinois as Mr. Livingston. Now we've done that little bit of scandal for you. There are 5 children of Eliza and William, and the names are basically, you're looking at John D. Rockefeller to your left, and his sister Lucy in the center, and his brother William standing at the right. And in the first row seated are his sister Mary Ann and his brother Frank. Now, both of the brothers would become involved in Standard Oil, but there's a story of contention between John D. and Frank Rockefeller, who I'm cursing over here, that goes on. So this is the family that arrives in Cleveland with the mother. Rockefeller enrolls in high school in Cleveland. As he's still boarding with Mrs. Wooden, the family for a while, the family will join him, and he goes to Central High. And Central High is an interesting factor in Cleveland's history. It was reputedly the first public high school west of the Allegheny Mountains. And this is the first school building of Central High. You've probably seen pictures of the other buildings, including one of the latest ones that was out in the Cedar Central area. He's a handsome young man. He's known in the classroom to be diligent and hardworking. He is not very much fun. He does not play games. He's a very serious young man by all descriptions that exclude his own. Well, he's at Central High, which is sort of a bastion in the 1850s for some of the best families of Cleveland. He meets with several friends. One of them is Marcus Alonzo Hanna. I'm going to turn a light on here because it's getting dark. Excuse me. And Mark Hanna's at the high school, and the other person is Laura Celestia Spellman, who will eventually become his wife. SETI is her nickname. Mark Hanna, interestingly enough, completes high school there, and then he goes on to a career initially in business, and he is one of the people in Cleveland who dabbles in oil. But unlike John D. Rockefeller, Mark Hanna's oil refinery burns down, as does one of his lake carriers. So this is the class that he's with, but Rockefeller drops out of high school before he completes it because he wants to get a more practical education. And he ends up at Folsom's Mercantile College in Cleveland. It's one of the first mercantile colleges in the United States, incorporated in 1851, but established in 1848. It will eventually turn into Dyke College. Dyke College will turn into Chancellor University, and Chancellor University collapses, as you probably know that story. But there he studies, basically, if you look at this document, he studies fine handwriting and script, and you can see some of the elegant script that's created, and he studies bookkeeping. And when he graduates, he goes into the business world. Now he's in the right place at the right time. And this is a very, very appropriate time to bring Cleveland in. Cleveland in the 1850s is a growing community. And let me bore you with some numbers. In 1850s, Cleveland's this picture, this lithograph is of Cleveland in 1853. You're looking from the west side and straight up the road. This is Superior Avenue, and this is Public Square. You can see it spreading to the east. This is the Ohio and Erie Canal coming in, and this is the Cuyahoga River. This is the Oxbow Bend, and more about that later. But let me give you the numbers. Cleveland's population in 1850 is 17,034. Ohio City is still separate. There's another 6,300. In 1860, the population of the merged cities is 43,000. In 1870, it is nearly 93,000. In 1880, it is 160,000. In 1900, it is 383,000 roughly. By 1920, Cleveland is the fifth largest city in the United States, and the value of its industrial production is fifth largest. But at the time this image is made, Cleveland has some nascent industries, but its main business is mercantilism. Buying and selling goods wholesale, they come in by lake steamers or brought up the canal, and then they're bought by brokers and commodity brokers, and they're sold. And that's where Rockefeller finds his job, within the commodities business. Let me zoom in on a section of this. This is an area of Cleveland that you can visit now. If you go down to Merwin's Wharf, the park, which is at the Columbus Street Bridge, you can walk Old Merwin Street in what is known as Cleveland Center. Merwin Street, if you're seeing the area here, and River Street were lined with warehouses where wholesale goods came in and where buyers came to get them, and where the profits were made. That is Rockefeller's world as a person when he gets a job. And a little bit about the job search in a few minutes. You'll notice here that at this point, without the Superior Viaduct or without the high-level bridge, Superior actually comes down to the river. And this building will be a site of one of Rockefeller's businesses later on. Cleveland also has other transportation going for it. So it's not only the river and the canal. It is a railroad network that begins to be built in the 1850s. This is the initial railroad station on West 9th Street. By the time of the Civil War, Cleveland is linked to the west to Chicago, to the east to New York. It's linked to the south to Pittsburgh, and also to Cincinnati. The first railroad is the Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati Railroad. Interestingly enough, another famous Clevelander, a Scotsman named Henry Chisholm, came to the city from Montreal, and that is via Glasgow and Lochgelly, Scotland. And he is hired as a contractor to build the docks for this for the center. He, like Rockefeller, is a member of the Baptist Church. They form a bit of a camaraderie. He's much older than Rockefeller. And that gets to what religion is here. Religion is a core factor in Rockefeller's life. This is the second iteration of the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church. It is situated on the site where the Cleveland Jewish Federation used to be located, where there is a new apartment building now at 18th and Euclid Avenue. There was a previous small church. And Rockefeller got his religion, a very strict religion, from his mother. His father's philandering may have had something to do with that. The mother was extremely religious. Some people wonder whether she really regretted marrying William after all. But when Rockefeller came to Cleveland, the first thing he did was affiliate with a church. It was a small shack, wooden missionary church of Euclid Avenue Baptist Church, not Euclid Avenue, but of Cleveland Baptist, which was then located near where the terminal is at this point. He began to work at the church, and we'll do a little bit more, but this is a critical factor for understanding his charities and his view of life. He is an extreme teetotaler. Alcohol never passed his lips, nor did it pass the lips of his son, John D. Rockefeller II. His employment history, briefly. September 26, 1885, he gets a job with Hewitt and Tuttle, who are commodities merchants. Now, 1855, you're looking at Rockefeller as being a 16-year-old man. Rockefeller beats the streets for a long time, and he writes about his job search. He's determined, he is focused, he goes to every place in Cleveland, he asks for jobs, and finally Hewitt and Tuttle takes him on as a bookkeeper. In 1858, Mr. Tuttle quits, and Rockefeller is essentially elevated to his position, but he does not get the title. By the way, a little trivia, when Rockefeller starts September 26, 1855, he does not get his initial pay until January of 1856. He patiently awaits it. One of his characteristics is basically being able, he's good with numbers, he is able to look ahead and figure out things, and he is extremely patient. He never gets overly excited. He will take abuse and not push back visibly. In 1858, he goes off, apparently because he's not happy with Tuttle, and he forms his own merchants firm with Maurice Clark. It's called Clark and Rockefeller. Maurice Clark is interesting. He's an Englishman who comes to Cleveland, and they basically raise the money. I think it's $5,000 each. Rockefeller has saved a good portion of his salary, but it's not enough, so he needs more money to buy into the partnership. He gets it from his father. His father charges him 10%. Rockefeller pays him back. In 1860, George Gardner joins the firm. Gardner is essentially he's a yachtsman. He's founder of one of the Cleveland Yacht Clubs. He becomes a mayor of Cleveland, and he and Rockefeller do not hit it off. Gardner tends to take time off from the business to go sail his yacht. He invites young John to go with him, and John will have nothing to do with it. 1863 is a major issue because this is where where Rockefeller gets into oil. And Clark is convinced to come in. Rockefeller really scouts out oil to begin with, and he wonders if it's going to be a successful commodity. And they're joined by another Englishman named Samuel Andrews. Now, Andrews is from Malmesbury, England. He's trained as a candle maker. He invents a refining process, and they begin to deal with oil. And Clark invites two of his brothers in, James and Richard Clark. So you're looking at 4 Englishmen in this firm. Eventually, Rockefeller opts out of the firm. The Clarks are pushed out. Rockefeller and Andrews will create the firm. William Rockefeller, John Dee's brother, joins them, and they begin to focus entirely on oil at this point. And a little bit more about that later. In 1870, they incorporate Standard Oil. It's capitalized at $1 million. There's a zero missing there. Sorry about that. There are 10,000 shares sold at $100 each, and the shares are held by John and William Rockefeller, Samuel Andrews, Stephen V. Harkness, and Henry Flagler. Now, as the business grows, and there are more to this, the Standard Oil Trust is formed in 1882. And this comes about as Rockefeller acquires refineries in other states and finds that state laws constrict his ability, the ability of Standard Oil to operate other institutions, other businesses out of state. So they form a trust in which those businesses, which are really owned by Standard Oil, trust their finances to a group of trustees that form Standard Oil. 1897, Rockefeller retires. 1911, the Rockefeller Trust is broken down into 34 companies. Now, some people would think, well, this is a real shame for Rockefeller, but he's quoted, he's remembered, I believe, in Chernow, that he's out playing golf, which is one of his favorite sports. And this is at Tarrytown near Pocuntico. And he's playing, I believe, with the minister. The minister said, well, this is bad news when the telegram comes in. And Rockefeller says, no, he says, I have more money than ever because he has stock in all the companies. May 4th, 1913, the Rockefeller Foundation is established. That's kind of the outline of his employment and business history. Let's look more deeply at this. This is Ledger A. One of the first things he does when he gets his first paycheck is to buy a ledger book. He keeps detailed track of all of his expenses, both his home expenses, his rent at Mrs. Woden, but most of all, you're looking at 1855, the missionary cause, 15 cents, Mr. Downey, 10 cents, the Mite Society, another cause, 75 cents, slip rent at the church, $1, Sabbath school contribution, 5 cents, present for Mr. Farrer, 25 cents, the 5-point mission, that's probably 12 cents, and then I can't read the other one. And then a present for Deacon Sked. Now, Deacon Sked is the minister, and he is really formative for Rockefeller. The missionary cause, 6 cents, and you see his early charity begins the minute he begins to make money, and a lot of it is dedicated to religious or what I would call missionary organizations. And you'll find that carry through all the way through his career. So we'll move from that to when Rockefeller and Andrews formed their business. You can see their name. This is a building. It is on the foot of Superior Street. The street going down the hill is Merwin Street, and that's where they start off. Samuel Andrews is somebody who deserves special attention, and some of you in Cleveland may know the story of Sam Andrews. He is self-taught, as I mentioned, he's a candle maker, but he discovers a process for refining oil. And if you don't know now, the reason for refining oil was not for gasoline, it was for kerosene. And that gets into a history we'll go into in a few seconds. Andrews eventually falls out with Rockefeller. It's after the company is incorporated. I believe it's in 1876. He's unhappy with the way that Rockefeller keeps reinvesting the money in the company. And so he mentions that he's unhappy to Rockefeller, and Rockefeller's getting a little upset with him. And basically, John D. says to Sam Andrews, well, what would you take to buy out of the firm? And Andrews says $1 million. And Rockefeller said, let me think about it. The next day, Andrews purportedly comes into the office, and there's $1 million check waiting for him. Andrews thinks he has won out because the oil business is still a little shaky at that time. And he uses part of the money to build this magnificent pile on Euclid Avenue. This is at the northeast corner of Euclid and East 30th Street. That's where the WEWS studios are. It's known as Andrews Folly. Purportedly, we don't know where the story comes from. He built it large enough not only to exhibit his wealth, but if Queen Victoria ever came to Cleveland, he would want to entertain her. Now that could well be apocryphal. The problem, though, was the house was impossible to maintain. They spent very little time there. His son Horace lived in the house for a while. It was boarded up. It became the site of a miniature golf course in the 1920s and eventually was torn down. Laura Spellman would marry Rockefeller, and this is an older picture of him. This is not their marriage picture. I couldn't find one at that time, on September 8th, 1864. And they went on an extraordinary honeymoon. They went up to Niagara Falls, they went to the White Mountains, and importantly, they stopped in New York City, which Rockefeller had never seen before. And this was a marriage of soulmates. The Spellman family, Laura and her sister Lucy, were from a family of abolitionists. The family settled in Akron. They moved to Cleveland, and that's where they met. She was a strict Baptist. It was a marriage made in heaven for them. And they raised their children, as we'll talk about later, in a very, very strict manner. And these are the children. And you're looking at Alta Rockefeller. You can read this as well as I can. 14, Bessie, who's the oldest, 19, Edith, 13, and John D, 13. And there's a photograph of, you can see a second child, Alice, who died in infancy. It's on the cabinet. And this was supplied by the Rockefeller Archives. This is from Grace Goulder, Izant's book. So there are 5 children, 1 wet male, and he's the last person born. Rockefeller basically is looked upon as somebody who was so serious that he could never celebrate. But when he married, he celebrated. He bought an extravagant ring for SETI. And when he had a son, he went into the office and was as joyous as the workers had ever seen him. So there's another side of the man, but is kept suppressed very often. We're going to go backwards a little bit and we'll talk about oil. This is Drake's Well in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, the first real oil well. But you have to know that oil was actually being harvested, floating off of streams beforehand. Native Americans used it as a remedy. And some people began to take what was called coal oil and use it for lamps. And this is where the market would go. The market was for illumination. And the prior means of illumination before coal oil and then kerosene were basically candles, tallow if you were poor, beeswax if you were wealthy, or sperm oil lamps if you were really wealthy. And by the 1850s, the whale population was being decimated. Sperm oil is getting more expensive. And so oil became a possibility. And they never had drilled for oil until Drake drilled for oil, and it became an oil rush in Western Pennsylvania. In Cleveland in 1865, 1863 is when they began to work with oil. They bought some land in 1863 at the confluence of the Cuyahoga River and Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run, nowadays more famous for the Torso murders, if you will, in the 1930s. This is Rockefeller's first oil refinery, the Excelsior refinery. The picture is circa 1865. His brother would eventually have a separate refinery next to this, and it was called the Standard, which is where the name of the company comes from. But these were not the only refineries in town. There were dozens of them. And refining oil was simple, it was cheap, but it was dangerous. And many of the refineries would burn down, including, as I mentioned, Mark Hanna's refinery. And this is how the Rockefeller business started out. What makes oil trade really chancy at that point is the surges in supply, the drop in price. And the chief example of this is a town called Pit Hole, Pennsylvania. This is the main street of Pit Hole, Pennsylvania during a main oil rush there in the early 1870s. It had a population of 20,000. Today, it is a ghost town with a historic site. And these are the barrels, the vats that they put the raw oil into. And the process of getting the oil out of Western Pennsylvania was extreme. It was nasty. Horses had a very short life. It was horse-drawn wagons. The horses were worked to death constantly. Finally, they would have railroads and pipelines come in. But Rockefeller visited these towns, which were full of brothels and saloons, much to his dislike, but he still was doing business there. And he saw the production end of oil was really too iffy, so he stayed in the refining end. But the refining end would be on the end of the cost of production. So as the price dropped for raw crude, the profit margin would go down. So Rockefeller had to work out a system to deal with it. So it goes from horses to rail cars. This is a reproduction rail car of how the cars came in. Rockefeller would eventually begin to build his own rail cars. And the cars would come in, and there's a very interesting story in the next image here. To the New Standard Works, was formed in 1870. These are the articles of incorporation of Standard Oil, January 10th, 1870. And I believe they were written out by Henry M. Flagler. And this is it. And during the investigations of Standard Oil's monopoly, when this document was brought out, people were astounded at its brevity and its simplicity, but it was still solid legally. The key to really making Cleveland an oil center was the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad. And if you're looking at the image to the left, this is the Atlantic and Great Western. It links up to the Erie Railroad, and it comes into Cleveland. And when Rockefeller bought that refinery site, the Excelsior site, it was just early 1860s. That's when the railroads completed to Cleveland. It was broad gauge, 6 feet. He bought the site next to the river where he could dump the waste, and next to the railroad where the cars would come in. So he had a lock on transportation. As he began to build his own railroad cars, that also provided a lock on transportation. In earlier maps, your right shows you where Oil City is. It'll show you where Meadville and Titusville are as well, and they all begin to be linked up by railroads. And the railroad industry is the major industry in the United States, and this is where the issue of Standard Oil gets very interesting. There's a Cleveland Railroad connection, and these are people that Rockefeller meets. The one to the left is Amasa Stone, and Amasa Stone is a railroad builder who comes to Cleveland from Massachusetts. He has patent on a Howe Truss Bridge. And Stone eventually, he builds the Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati Railroad, and the Cleveland, Painesville, and Ashtabula Railroad, which is eventually merged into the Lakeshore. The other man is John H. Devereaux, who is second in command of Union Railroads in the Civil War. And these are connections that Rockefeller will exploit. And eventually what he does when Standard Oil is started, he uses them to get to Cornelius Vanderbilt, who is the head of the New York, what will become the New York Central Railroad. And they work out with Vanderbilt and the Erie Railroad initially a special deal where, given Rockefeller's quantity of oil, that they will get rebates on any shipment they make on the railroad. So they're getting a deal because they're shipping in quantity, which is good for Rockefeller, and it's good for the railroad because the railroad has a guaranteed number of tank cars that it's going to move all the time. So this is the conniving and the connection between the railroads and Rockefeller. But it gets even more serious with this. This is the South Improvement Company, and this is it's misprinted here, the Southern Improvement Company, but this is the blacklist done, and this is by oil producers who were pushed out. Essentially, it's the Atlantic and Great Western, the Lakeshore, Michigan Southern, the Philadelphia and Erie, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, and the Erie Railroad all get together and they work with the major refiners and major producers, and they make a deal. The deal is, this is 1870, 71, 72, if I recall correctly. The deal is that they get rebates, but also they get a drawback on oil shipped by people who are not part of the West, the Southern Improvement Company, the South Improvement Company. And the drawback is 40 cents a barrel on the price that somebody else is paying to ship it. And the word gets out to the producers. And this South Improvement Company is built on a bit of shady Pennsylvania law. And eventually the hue and the outcry of this is extraordinary. And the railroads eventually back off of it. Now, this brings up an issue of contention in the story of John D. Rockefeller, because Rockefeller denies any involvement in the South Improvement Company. Indeed, if you read Grace Goulder's account, it seems that the involvement was totally on the part of Henry Flagler. But if you're reading Ron Chernow is quoting letters from John D. Rockefeller, who is in New York meeting with the railroad companies, to his wife, talking about the negotiations in various ways. So Rockefeller is implicated in this. One of the producing families that gets hurt in this is the family of Ida Tarbell, who we will meet a little bit later. This is Henry Flagler, better known for developing Florida, and Stephen Harkness. They are two of the prime factors in the company, and I am going to find a book, and if I can find it here for you, and read you a little section about how they are related. So if you're ready for a reading from Grace Goulder's book. With Flagler now one of the firm, Rockefeller had a ready-made entree to the moneyed Harknesses in Bellevue, Ohio. Flagler's wife, the former Mary Harkness, was a first cousin of Stephen Harkness, Mr. Flagler's father. Mr. Flagler's father, Lamont Harkness, and Stephen's father, David, both physicians, were brothers. Now, if you get this straight, we'll have a test afterwards. There were other connections between the remarkable family and Flagler. His mother had been widowed twice before she married his father, Isaac Flagler, an impoverished itinerant Presbyterian minister in Western New York State. Her son was christened Harry Morrison Flagler, the boy's middle name being that of his mother's second husband. Her first husband was David Harkness, Stephen's father, a widower whom she married when she married him. From this marriage, Daniel Harkness was born. Daniel was the half-brother of Stephen and also of Flagler. Flagler and Stephen, however, were no blood kin, but they had been close friends since their youth. The interrelationships were tangled further when Daniel married his first cousin, Isabel Harkness, who was a sister of Flagler's wife, Mary. Now, if you can figure that out, I'll give you my copy of the book. But these people profited incredibly from Standard Oil. The initial stockholders, some of the later stockholders profited, and that's where the money comes from. Oliver Payne Very interesting man. He buys into the company. He is the son of Henry Payne, who was named after Oliver Hazard Perry, who was a member of the Perry family and a relative of him. They come from the Payne and Perry family. The Perry family, very early settlers in Cleveland. Oliver serves in the Civil War, and we'll get to the Civil War in a little bit when we get to Frank Rockefeller. And he is a major figure in running Standard Oil. The Standard Oil Company in Kingsbury Run looks like this by 1889. It has grown enormously. And a little sidebar, if you want to look at another consequence of Standard Oil in Cleveland, I highly recommend this book by one of our PhDs, John Vlasic, Standard Oil and the Limits of Efficiency. It's called Refining Nature. And it looks at the major refineries in Cleveland and Whiting, Indiana, and it looks at the pollution and environmental problems that came from the oil industry. Suffice it to say, when people came to Cleveland in the 1870s, and if they came by boat, the first thing they smelled on the lake was oil. And the major industry in Cleveland in terms of monetary production, if you will, was the oil industry at that time. It would be overwhelmed by the steel industry in the 1880s. So I would recommend Vlasic's book to you. And then you have the two brothers. You have William on the left and Frank on the right. Frank is the youngest brother. He is the only member of the family to serve in the Civil War. He tries to join when he is too young. He goes back in and he's finally accepted. He is in battle, he is wounded. And the other brothers, John D. claims that John buys a substitute in the Civil War. He justifiably, I suppose, claims that he is raising a family and building a business. And this time it is mostly provisions, and the provision business is growing because of the Civil War. This will fly back in his face later on when Standard Oil becomes viewed as a bad monopoly. Frank Rockefeller is happy-go-lucky. He is part of Standard Oil, but he is not basically nose to the grindstone like his brother. Eventually, they have a falling out. Frank has family members buried at Lakeview Cemetery. He has them disinterred from the major family plot, and Frank and his family are buried in a separate plot in Lakeview. William, as I mentioned, creates his own refinery, and in the early 1870s, he is sent to New York City. Kerosene is export. And by one time, 70% of Standard's production of export is basically being shipped out to Europe, and eventually a huge Chinese market is developed. So this is one of the connections to New York. Rockefeller will relocate full-time to New York in 1885. The building you're looking at, the Standard Oil building to your right, is the one built in 1921. The buildings that you are looking at to your left, I'm sorry, the building to your right is the building to your left is the Standard building. Buildings to your right are the two Rockefeller mansions. The smaller one is John D's, and the second one is his son's mansion. John D bought an existing mansion that was decorated by the previous owner. So if you want to see the interior, there it is. Not to Rockefeller's taste, but they left it that way. So by 1885, Rockefeller has become a legal resident in New York City because that's where the business is. And indeed, as he expands refineries, he is essentially looking at refineries that are on the East Coast because of their proximity to shipping. The other thing I forgot to mention when we're looking at the South Improvement Company is that following that in 1872, Rockefeller senses that the future of the oil industry is not in freewheeling free enterprise, but it's in consolidation. And he begins a process of buying all the other refineries in Cleveland. He buys almost all of them except 6. It's a good time to buy them because the South Improvement Company looks like it might be going ahead. The oil prices have plummeted. Some of the refineries are losing money, and Rockefeller will either offer stock to the wise people or he will offer cost. Many people are supposedly, according to Goulder, are happy to be bought out by Rockefeller. Others later in the century will see him as somebody who underpaid him. This is a hard thing to sort out. In 1868, Rockefeller buys a house in Cleveland, an existing mansion at 40th and what is now 40th and Euclid, and that is the building to your left. He redoes the building. He has a building next to it moved around, and it becomes a school for women, Miss Middleburger's school. It's actually moved out, rolled down what is now 40th Street, then Case Avenue, and placed to the rear of the Rockefeller property. But also in the 1870s, early 70s, he invests in what is going to be a health cure sanitarium out in East Cleveland Township in Forest Hill. And this is the Forest Hill property that will become his summer home. Once he moves to New York City, he and the family will come back to Forest Hill. They will spend their summers here. They will stay long enough not to be taxed. And this is where a lot of the memories are. And this is where a lot of the Rockefeller, I think, legend and remainders are in Cleveland. As he begins to grow the business, he becomes more and more inundated by requests for charitable assistance. And for a long time, he tries to handle them by himself. He judges the requester or the requesting organization and then will make his own judgment. Let me say that Ken Rose put together a list of Rockefeller's charitable contributions in Cleveland, Ohio between 1864 and 1903. And the total contributions that they found in Rockefeller's charitable card file were $1,625,522.77, an extraordinary amount of money for the time. But as this goes on, it gets beyond him. And this brings him into contact with another Baptist minister who is working on trying to get funding for a Baptist university in Chicago, Illinois. There was a University of Chicago, started in part by Frederick Douglass, that had closed its doors. They wanted to start a Baptist university. And they were interested in starting a university in a major city that would draw people who were Baptists from the East and from the West. That's why they chose Chicago. And Frederick Taylor Gates was working on this project, and that's how he met Rockefeller. And Gates would eventually end up working for Rockefeller as his main fiscal advisor from 1891 to 1923. He met Rockefeller in 1889, and that's when the touch was put on Rockefeller to fund the University of Chicago. They were looking for $1 million. And essentially, Rockefeller initially pledged far less than, I believe he pledged $400,000. They came back at him and he eventually provided $600,000 for the University of Chicago. We'll get into the question of why he funded that university versus Western Reserve shortly. But that is one of his major charitable donations. This is the dedication of the University of Chicago. That's John D. Rockefeller walking next to William Rainey Harper. William Rainey Harper is the president of the University of Chicago. He's a wunderkind. He graduated with his PhD at the age of 20. His study was religion. He met with Rockefeller frequently. They got on very well. They got on so well that as William Rainey Harper developed the university, he was able to rob faculty from all the major universities with the promise of prize salaries. He built the university much beyond Rockefeller's initial donation. Eventually, Rockefeller would invest, I believe, $130 million in the university. And that is Gates walking behind him. At the dedication, Rockefeller was cheered by the students of the university. They had a cheer, sort of rah, rah, Rockefeller, looked upon very, very benevolently for what he had done. But this fits into his charitable milieu. This was a building, this was a university that he could fund from the ground up. It wasn't a pre-existing entity. This is what Ken Rose argues. Rockefeller was looking for something that he could help form, not something that was already formed. But more importantly, it was a Baptist institution. And that's where he wanted his money to go. Now, Rainey had some theological theories that were a little counter to pure baptism, but Rockefeller let that slip. Rainey would die early in 1906. It's an incredible university because it's created to be the equal of Yale, Harvard, or whatever right from the get-go. And it even had a prize football team to begin with. All of this begins to come to a head in the late 19th and early 20th century as Americans become concerned about the growth of huge monopolies, whether it's the packing house monopoly, or whether it is the railroad monopoly, or whether it is the oil monopoly. And Ida Tarbell, pictured here in 1905, is approached by the head of McClure's magazine to write what would be called muckraking articles about Rockefeller and Standard Oil. And there are 19 issues of McClure's magazine that are published at that point. And that then ends up in a full biography, a full history of Standard Oil Company in 1904. This is published in 1904. And this really, and some previous publications, begin to make Rockefeller what is my friend Ken Rose would call the most hated man in America at that time. Interestingly, Demarest Lloyd had published Wealth Against Commonwealth in 1894, which dealt with the history of Standard Oil. It had some factual errors and it took too hard a line. Tarbell's writing is more nuanced, but yet at the age of 14, that's when she saw her father lose the business in Pennsylvania. And Rockefeller's nickname for her was Miss Tarbarrel. These are some of the cartoons that would circulate at the time. So he had his hands into railroads, he had his hands into iron ore, and he had his hands into coal. And then we get to something that comes up in 1915. This is one of my favorite cartoons, and this is the caption to this is "What a funny little government." So your choice, is it Rockefeller the philanthropist or is Rockefeller the evil monopolist? What is going on? It's interesting because early stories of Rockefeller do talk about his fascination with money. And there's one that is both in the book by Chernow and the book by Grace Goulder Isant, and that is that when he was working for Hewlett and Tuttle, somebody brought in a check for $4,000 and put it in the safe. And he would go there and he would open the safe and just simply stare at the check. He'd never seen that much money before. By the way, he never ran a deficit. And you'll see some of the money. So is it stress? This is the Rockefeller that some of us know. We're coming finally to the denouement of this. In 1901, his wife recorded in a diary that John Dee's eyebrows had fell out, his mustache fell out. He lost all of his bodily hair due to alopecia. Initially, he tried to cover it up with the black skull cap, and eventually he bought a wig. But really what's happening at this point is the power in the family is transferring to John D. Rockefeller Jr. There are two pictures of him. And so when we're looking at Rockefeller's charity at this time, they're not only influenced by Gates, but they're going to be influenced by his son's attitudes. And John D. is born in Cleveland. He's brought up, he goes to Forest Hill. He's there every summer, but he's brought up in New York. And he will eventually marry the daughter of Senator Aldrich. And so this, you're seeing the family morph into what I would call more of a New York of philanthropy and aristocratic family at that point. This is just a quick photo here. Rockefeller giving out dimes. Now I could not find the origin of this, but he gave out dimes and nickels. He would give them to wealthy people, to poor people, to kids on the street. The Historical Society has two bracelets made of dimes that were given to Adela Prentice Hughes, the founder of the Musical Arts Association in Cleveland. Cleveland responded to all this bad news about Rockefeller by 400 people coming up to Forest Hill in 1905 and praising John D. Rockefeller. And actually, there's a pamphlet published on this, and this is a visit to Mr. John D. Rockefeller by neighbors and friends at Forest Hill, Cleveland, Ohio. So there was support for him when he was undergoing this pressure. 8 years later, there's a bill, and they come back to their summer at Forest Hill. This is actually his sister-in-law, Lucy Rockefeller, walking with him at the train station. This is at basically a Quite Road and East 105th Street and near Bracknell. And so that whole issue, let me get to, in 1913, his wife Seti became ill while in Cleveland. She could not be moved back to New York without endangering her. So Rockefeller overstayed the time period that made him supposedly taxless in Cleveland. And immediately when that period of time was overshot, the county hit him for a bill of $1.5 million, or if he paid late, $2.25 million. And this supposedly rankled his attitude toward Cleveland. He was known to say that Cleveland was very unfair to him at times. Eventually, they would move to go back to New York. The family would never come for a full summer at Forest Hill after that. Rockefeller would turn up, but he couldn't turn up immediately because he was under fear of subpoena. So Seti died in New York, up in Tarrytown. She was buried in a mausoleum there. And John D. Rockefeller Jr. said to his father, you know, you should not have her buried in the family plot in Cleveland. I don't want you to. And Rockefeller responded that they were both going to be buried in Cleveland. And that would happen on Rockefeller's death. So this is one of the instances. Rockefeller would come back and forth to that for short stays. But in 1917, the complex burned to the ground, and the main house burned to the ground. And there are people in Cleveland who have conspiracy theories about this. You can't really trace the origin of that fire. So let's get to what happened to Rockefeller. Legacies and questions. Why not Cleveland? I'm sorry, the University of Chicago is $35 million that was spent on that. Why didn't that go to Western Reserve or the Case School of Applied Sciences? Rockefeller Center, why didn't we get that? $250 million estimated cost, it ran over that. Why didn't that come to Cleveland? I had to throw this in. This is John D. Rockefeller Jr. at the opening of Radio City Music Hall, looking a little out of place with the Rockettes. The case of the university. This is quoted from Grace Golder. When he, Rockefeller, offered millions to lift Western Reserve to the top cloud of the academic heaven, a trustee said coolly, "Tell Mr. Rockefeller Cleveland will take care of its own." That was quoted in the Cleveland Plain Dealer in 1961. Supposedly the trustee was going to be Samuel Mather. The other quote from Grace Golder, "There is little doubt that Western Reserve could have gotten sick. The heavy financial backing that John D. Rockefeller finally gave to the University of Chicago, if it had really gone after his support. Reserve graduates after the turn of the century believed that Rockefeller actually tried to endow the university, but was turned down because of the influence of the Mather family." Well, we know that he met Samuel Mather once in his lifetime. And Sam Mather came to New York and met Rockefeller in his office. They met for about 20 minutes. And the meeting was about Rockefeller's interest in iron ore and shipping. And Rockefeller wanted Mather to build him a fleet of ships. It was a $13 million project. Mather initially demurred and said, "I don't think so," because he was running his own fleet. And Rockefeller said, "Well, you know, if you don't build them, somebody else will." And so Mather took the money. Now, Mather lived in a different social circle than Rockefeller. The Baptists were not the Episcopalians in Cleveland. So that was different. If you look at Millionaires Row in Cleveland, Ohio, and all the grand parties there, that was not a place that you would find Mr. Rockefeller. You would find Rockefeller on the street racing his horses. He had a great sense of horse flesh. And he reveled in his early days of taking fast carriage rides down Euclid Avenue. But party was not what he did. So, but there's something about the statement that doesn't hold, because we know that the president of the university, Hiram Hayden, began approaching John D. Rockefeller for help beginning in 1888, about the same time that he was being approached by Chicago. And so the asks were already out there, but Rockefeller politely turned him down. But we do know from Grace Goulder that over time, $4 million did come to Western Reserve. And this is the breakdown. $2 million plus personally from John D. Rockefeller or from the General Education Fund or from the Rockefeller Foundation. Of this, $1.590 went to the medical school. And you can read the uses there. The remaining $417,000 went to various endowment funds, to the School of Applied Social Sciences and to alterations for Eldred Hall. Another $125,000 was given to a joint Delbert College for Women endowment campaign. And then $10,000, this is really interesting, is given to Flora Stone Mather House, which is exactly where I have my, the Mather Women's Dormitory, where my office is. $5,000 from John D. Rockefeller, $5,000 from his wife, to honor Mrs. Mather and their high regard for her and Mr. Mather. So there's something else moving here. There was other school. There was the Case School of Applied Sciences, so we can't look at these as a merged unit yet. And he provided money for the building that still stands, the Rockefeller building, the physics lab, and for a mining and metallurgy building, which has since been demolished, $200,000. Religion is a major factor. And one of the things that you will see a lot of money coming to Cleveland from Rockefeller is for things that are religious. And this is the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church, its first iteration, which against Rockefeller's wishes was torn down because they wanted to build a grander Baptist church in the 1920s. This is the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church that stood on 18th Street with a commercial front to it. It's now part of the Cleveland State campus. The tower was never completed. The cost of this kept going up, but altogether, we find out that the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church in Cleveland between 1855 and 1934 received a total of $727,754 from the Rockefellers. The church basically was built in the wrong place at the wrong time. Interest in religion was waning. The congregation dwindled. I mean, it had a hall to host 3,000 people. I believe the sanctuary that could hold 2,500 is built of colored terracotta brick. It's an extraordinary building that saw the Records Ball. And again, if you're looking at religion and Rockefeller's charity, let me read a few more for you here. The YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, about $153,000. The YWCA, $153,000 as well. The Baptist City Mission got $115,000. So if you're looking at his main charities in Cleveland, they tend to be religious. Our Rockefeller Center is the Rockefeller Building, built between 1904 and 1905. It eventually was sold to a man named Josiah Kirby during the 1920s. He put his own name up, and John D. Rockefeller Sr. told his son to buy it back. This building is now being partially converted into apartments. I think I have a cost of this building someplace in my notes here. No, I don't. And it is built in 2 phases, and it's built on the site of the old Waddell House Hotel. But one of the things, if you have a tourist to Cleveland and you bring them to Public Square now, they see Rockefeller and they understand this. But perhaps the major aspect of Cleveland that is Rockefeller named is Rockefeller Park, which links Wade Park and Gordon Park, 2 private parks that were given to the city by Gordon and by Jephthah Homer Wade. The city was buying property between them and to create a connector, something we drive down MLK every day. And at the city's bicentennial celebration in 1896, at a meeting, public meeting, a telegram was received, and the telegram was from John D. Rockefeller saying that he would recompense the city for all the land they bought, and he went on to buy other properties around there, and he went on to fund the bridges that are over the boulevard and Doan Brook. So there's money there, and the cost of that for Cleveland parks generally, $865,000. Let me go through another one. Another structure for Cleveland is Alta House in the Italian section on Mayfield Road, which could be one of the routes that would be taken up to one end of Forest Hill, and that was built at the behest of Joseph Carabelli, stonecutter, a skilled stonecutter who did a lot of stonework in Lakeview Cemetery, including the obelisk at the Rockefeller grave. That's the original building, which opened in 1900. The building was torn down after a huge fire, and that is now partly a bocce court, and then there's the library behind it. And so that is another major settlement, $308,000 over time. And as for our Rockefeller Center, well, it had already been built by the Van Sweringens. It's the terminal tower development. The decision maker in a lot of the funding was his son. I love this colorized photograph. And one of the things his son invested in was Forest Hill. And Forest Hill was eventually deeded in part as a park to the city of Cleveland Heights and city of East Cleveland, and a major portion of it then was turned into a development. The Rockefeller houses were begun just before the Depression. They were never fully completed because of slow sales in the Depression. You probably know these in the Forest Hills allotment. You know the Rockefeller building on Mayfield Road and Lee Road, and that was built to house all the support industries plus a bank. So there were grand schemes for Forest Hills, but they fell through until after the Depression, after the war, and the modern Forest Hills, sort of the mid-century moderns, were built in the other sections. This is the park today. This is the lake today. And so you can see to the right of Lee Boulevard, the sections that were platted out for residential development. And it's not just the Rockefellers. So if you're looking at Payne, Oliver Hazard Payne, you have to realize that she is an uncle of Francis Payne Bolton. And so the money will filter down to from the Binghams, the Paynes, the Boltons, to the Boltons. If you're looking at Harkness, Harkness will end up funding Harkness Chapel, and there's a story behind that. That is in the Case Western Reserve campus, and it is to one of the Harknesses. Oh, and the notes have been lost. Here we go. Harkness Memorial was built to Florence Harkness Severance, who married Louis Severance, who was the son of John L. Severance. In 1894, she died less than a year later. It's a fascinating person. She went to the East and did social work before she married. And so this structure cost $121,000. It's one of the highlights of the Mather Quad. Severance. Louis Henry Severance, the father of John Long Severance, was the treasurer of Standard Oil. And what you're seeing John Long Severance do is turn the first shovelful of earth for Severance Hall. So the question is how much money filters through that. Elizabeth Severance Prentice, another inheritor. This is 1913 when Louis Henry dies. He left an estate that was worth nearly $15 million. If you read this carefully, Standard Oil shares were selling for $1,000 a share. He had 5,070 shares of Standard Oil. So we're looking at money filtering down. And then there's Frederick Goff, who worked for a law firm that handled Rockefeller's business for 2 years before he went on to Cleveland Trust. But if you know Frederick Goff, he started the Cleveland Foundation, which was started a year after the Rockefeller Foundation. And so again, perhaps not the money, but the idea comes in. But Goff's Foundation is different. It is a public foundation with public trustees on it. That is kind of what I would say is the legacy of Cleveland. We don't look in the right place. We're always looking for Rockefeller's name, but we need to see where it filters down. There's no way you can quantify that money, but a lot of the Standard Oil money stayed in Cleveland. A lot of the ancillary money stayed there. 1937, John D. Rockefeller passed. His house on Euclid Avenue was demolished the following year. If you want to find bits and pieces of it, you can find it in a house on Broadway Avenue, because a lot of the stuff was salvaged and reused. And you can still go see John D. Rockefeller, who was buried in Lakeview Cemetery, and people do go there and they leave dimes on the tombstone. So with that, let me just get to the last legacies total. Rockefeller left $26 million in his estate, of which $16 million went to state and federal taxes. At his death, he had given 530 million, of which 446 million had been allocated to the philanthropic agencies he had established. His son, John D., between 1917 and 1960, gave away $537 million directly and $540 million through the Rockefeller charities. So if you're looking at Grand Teton National Park, or if you're looking at Colonial Williamsburg, you're looking at his money there. Interestingly, Ron Chernow, in writing in 1996, said that the descendants of the Rockefellers at that point in 1996 were worth more than $6.2 billion. And so that opens up a question. These are the major beneficiaries that I went through. Of whether he was evil or whether he eventually did good. And I'll end with this slide. It's a Google aerial view of where Standard Oil Refinery number 1 was located. And you'll notice too, just if you can follow my cursor here, there's a street named Rockefeller Avenue. It was not named Rockefeller Avenue until relatively recently. The oil company moved away from Cleveland. This is a brownfield now, and it basically houses a storage area for containers. And here at the upper level where the offices were, there's some offices down below. There used to be a plaque on this one. Concrete, recycled concrete is there. And one last thing about a connection to Rockefeller. If you go down Rockefeller Boulevard, Rockefeller Street, and you continue to go onto Independence Road, you will see one of the last buildings, the Griselli Chemical Works. If you know the Griselli name in Cleveland, you know it's appended to a structure at John Carroll University, and it is appended to many charities. The Griselli chemical plant moved to Cleveland to supply sulfuric acid to the oil refineries, and John D. Rockefeller was their major business. Indeed, after he consolidated the refineries in Cleveland during the Cleveland massacre, it was probably their only business. So I will leave you with that. I'm running a little late. And I think we have tons of questions.
Yes,
Well,
we do have tons of questions. Michael has been compiling them here for us. So
didn't mean to go on that long, but
here we go. Yeah. So here's the first one. Was there some sort of tax break that Rockefeller was trying to avoid by limiting his stays in Cleveland? Was that a?
Yeah, well, if he was paying full taxes in New York State, but because he claimed he was not in Cleveland for the requisite time, and he was paying his taxes in New York City, I'm sorry, that he wasn't liable for Cleveland taxes. That was his argument against that tax grab. And the other thing I didn't state is the income tax does not come in until 1913. There's a brief income tax during the Civil War period, which is later ruled unconstitutional. An income tax only becomes constitutional when a constitutional amendment is passed. So Rockefeller and Carnegie and other people who are piling up money are not paying taxes on it, income taxes.
Interesting.
More than 750 bucks.
Yeah. What was the relationship between Rockefeller and the bankers in Cleveland?
The bakers?
Bankers.
Bankers.
Yes.
Very good. Extremely good. And if you read Goulder's book, it will pinpoint. He was known for such straight business practices and kept good books that he got extraordinary amounts of money from them. That's how they were able to capitalize Standard Oil. He had the bankers' trust almost completely.
Very nice. And the same in New York?
I think so. And one of the reasons he went to New York, good question.
Yeah.
One of the reasons he went to New York was not only because of the export facilities there, because New York was really the financial. He had tapped out most of the available money in Cleveland.
In Cleveland.
So he was going to New York banks, and that's why New York becomes the center of it all. And the irony of this, and I'll prolong this for a second, is the canal that helped make Cleveland the mercantile metropolis connected to another canal, the Erie Canal, that some historians will argue made New York City, because it then became the major East Coast port with direct water connections to the growing Midwest. And that's why New York grows.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, we're on the wrong canal.
Yeah. What about the Civil War? Did Rockefeller ever express regret for not serving?
Yeah, I think he did eventually express regrets, but there are stories that he gave to almost all the Civil War charities in Cleveland. The Women's Sanitary Commission got donations from Rockefeller, and I forget who it was. I think it was Levi Schofield brought in a group of new recruits to meet Rockefeller on their way to the railroad station, and he gave each one of them a crisp $10 bill, which was a heck of a lot of money at that time.
Mhm.
One of the recruits said, "Man, this guy must be rich." And this is his money that he had simply made on the commissions business at that point.
Um, okay, so Rockefeller's quote unquote interests were accused of bribing legislators in Ohio and elsewhere. Was
Mhm.
it really illegal at the time, or was it just how it was done?
It was illegal at the time. It was how it was done. And it's interesting because the state of Ohio eventually did the first antitrust suit against Rockefeller before they went to a federal suit. And there was some shenanigans going on there.
Mm.
And it's interesting because when Rockefeller started the Rockefeller Foundation, he wanted to have a national charter. And so he used Aldrich and other levers to get some interest, but it never occurred. So that's why it was chartered in the state of New York.
Mm. New York has all of the things. This is an interesting take. Would you consider Rockefeller's philanthropic benevolence a defining factor to the success of capitalism in the US? Was his monopoly, really that bad considering he was a devout Christian and consistently giving back to help the poor and the destitute?
That is a very, very good question. And the point is brought up many times. Some people would say that Rockefeller simply gave money to assuage for his sins as a capitalist, but it was inherent in him already. Uh, the point is, and I will go to that. This is how the system has worked in the United States. And let's just say that I work in Mather House, which was funded in part by John D. Rockefeller. I am supported by two endowments, one of which somebody sold a lot of stock in Walt Disney, which helps support me. So it's there, but as one of my colleagues once quoted, and I will be very blunt about this, we were looking at a site, the Rockefeller Red House is a possible building for an organization she ran. And I said, well, this is ideal because Rockefeller supported Spelman College. And basically, I didn't mention that. That's another major. And so, the philanthropy is going out there. And the response was, well, wouldn't it have been better if he just paid his workers more money? And that's the flip side of it. And if you look at Cleveland in the 1880s, 1890s, there's a huge strike at the rolling mills in 1882, another one in 1885. There are bloody streetcar strikes in Cleveland. Cleveland, we're trying to sort out the relationship between the worker and the new capitalist system. So there are different ways of looking at it. Ask a short question and get a long answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, so much you could say about what's going on in America today, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about Rockefeller's attitudes about African Americans and Jews? Can you comment on that?
His attitudes toward African Americans were very favorable. And that is, he was married into an abolitionist family. And if I had that list of charities, you can find a number of gifts to your African American associations, and I think including Eliza Bryant Home. He actually paid $15 a donation to John Patterson Green, an African American attorney, to support a trip to Europe. So there was great sympathy for that. I believe somebody has found that he actually donated to one of the early Jewish congregations in Cleveland as well. And you'll find money going to Catholic charities as well. But the bulk of his religious giving is purely Baptist.
Baptists, yeah. So basically, this next question is, has Cleveland been cursed by the Rockefellers? Is there evidence that the Rockefeller family was punishing Cleveland for the snub? And it seemed like Cleveland was under a dark cloud for so many years.
I don't think it's the curse of the Rockefellers. I know I don't think John D was upset with the city. His son, John D. II, seemed to be more upset with the city. I think really because of those last incidents. But yet he was going to build, well, it's going to be a money-making enterprise before city allotment. But there's no curse on Cleveland. It's
At least not from Rockefeller.
not from Rockefeller. I mean, if we were New York, we'd be doing better, but maybe.
Did Rockefeller influence Cyrus Eaton?
Oh, yes.
Northeast Ohio business person.
Yeah, Cyrus Eaton knew him as a child. Reverend Eaton would golf with Rockefeller. Rockefeller had a 9-hole golf course on his Forest Hill estate. And Cyrus Eaton would met him there. He was interviewed extensively by Grace Goulder for her book, and there's some really good comments about Cyrus Eaton, from Eaton about Rockefeller there.
Let's see. So this question, do you know that if there were a lot of people who left Cleveland for Florida after Henry Flagler went there and developed the railroads and sold land?
I don't think so. I think it was, some people of wealth would go down to the Flagler resorts in Florida. I think the great exodus of Clevelanders to Florida, sort of the middle class, begins in the 1920s with the land boom that goes bust. And more recently, after the Second World War, as people snowbirded down there. But it's Flagler who really developed Florida and gave it a name.
Yeah. So the Rockefeller Foundation is still alive. Well, who are the beneficiaries of the Rockefeller Foundation today?
I can't tell you, but you could look up the foundation's website and they should be able to show you where the money is going. It goes all over the world. There's a health foundation, I forget the name of it. It built a hospital in Beijing in the 1920s. It's still operating, but under a different name at this point. There was a great interest in Cleveland philanthropists in Asia. I think one of the severances gave a lot of money to Korea. But yeah, do go look at the Rockefeller Foundation website and see where they're giving now.
So one of our viewers is from Oil City, Pennsylvania.
Wow.
At the National Transit Company, which became a division of Pennzoil. Asked, did Rockefeller have any connections to Pennzoil and Quaker State?
I don't know. I don't know if those were started independently, remained independently, or if those were break-offs. I honestly can't say that I know about that. But that all relies on the myth, the wonderful, you get oil from the original wells, you think, really. Heaven knows what pipeline is coming out of there now.
Some have argued, here's another one, some have argued that Henry Flagler's marketing and sales and strategic skills really made Standard Oil the success that it became. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, that comes up as well. Flagler was an extraordinarily handsome, dashing young man. And basically he was taking risk left and right, but he took the good risk. And if I'm not mistaken, now it's either Harkness or Flagler who lost a fortune in salt commodities and then rebuilt. But Flagler had a good line with the banks. So that's pretty true. Rockefeller was, okay, he was not a fun guy to be around, but they're supposed. But Flagler, there's a picture of Flagler in the Goulder book that is just awesome.
What was Rockefeller's relationship with Cleveland political elite before his falling out over the taxes?
Cleveland's political elite? I'm not sure. And it wasn't the political elite. There were two people in the taxation department of the county that did that. So I'm not sure what his relationship would have been. Well, certainly with the mayor of the city, Tom L. Johnson. I'm not certain what his relationship would have been with the mayors of the city, so I can't answer that with any authority.
Okay. Are any Rockefellers still in Cleveland?
I don't know. We had the descendants of Winthrop Rockefeller from Arkansas, I believe, come to Cleveland for the Republican National Convention in 2016. And that shot of the grave, if you saw the shoes in the shot, But those were some of the people who came there to honor the old man.
Oh. Um, let's see. How about one more? What about John Huntington, who also made his money in the oil business?
Yeah, that's tied to Rockefeller, and Huntington is, you know, the major educational fund from that, and more investments. So it is. I mean, if you scratch the Cleveland Foundation, you scratch the foundations that funded the Art Museum and other places, you will find oil money in there someplace.
Yeah.
I think Jeff DeHomer Wade actually invested in Rockefellers at one point. I would leave my colleague, Dr. Holly Witchy, to talk about the Wades. She's the absolute expert on the Wade family.
Oh, nice. And I believe we have the last of this series, the fourth lecture, which is not until December.
Yeah.
It's going to be about the Wade family women and
She is
their legacy.
extraordinary. Yeah. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I turned into a shadow with the lighting in this room here.
Yeah, it's sort of the backlighting. It was bright in your room when the lecture started, and then night fell. So you sort of slowly moved into shadow.
It's gotten darker. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This was
right. Well, I would, you know, recommend to everybody. This is just a gloss. It's a gloss review. Chernow's book Titan is a huge volume. It is well worth investing in, and Goulder's book is well worth investing. Dare I say that Goulder's book is more friendly to Rockefeller than Chernow's, and that is because Grace Goulder, Izant's husband, was a messenger boy on the Rockefeller estate in Forest Hills.
Huh.
So there's a little bit of a tie there.
Yeah.
And she started the book
information from his experiences and anecdotes, or
yeah, there's many that she has from him, and he passed just before the book was published in 1972. She was the Cleveland historian.
Yeah, fantastic. This is great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I think I'm going to go break Rockefeller's rule and have a glass of wine.
Prepare yourself for the debate.
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody. And yeah, we hope to see you guys back here in 2 weeks to talk about Michael White and Cleveland during his mayoral.
Yeah, I was going to give everybody a dime, but there are too many people out there. I can't afford it.
Maybe a nickel instead.
Okay, thank you. Right. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Everybody have a good night.